Good evening, welcome. Also, on behalf of Mario Daniels, my colleague at the Duitsland Institute Amsterdam, with whom I've organized this lecture. My name is Peter van Dam. I'm a professor of Dutch history here at the University of Amsterdam, and I coordinate the research group Environment and Society, which brings together humanities research on the history of the environment and related subjects. Unfortunately, we are living through an age of accelerating climate crisis. Coming to terms with human-made climate change also means we have to reconsider what we thought we knew about the past. In the Netherlands, for example, this changes our view of the history of gas extraction in Groningen. What once appeared as a fortunate discovery and a great source of prosperity now rather appears as the history of an unfolding disaster. Coming to terms with our predicament, the concept of the Anthropocene has been much discussed lately. And today we would like to explore the value of this concept for reconsidering how we regard the past. And above and beyond the discussion of the concept itself, maybe the even more important question, how do we write history under the conditions that that concept, the Anthropocene, tries to articulate? And I'm very honored and very excited to welcome Sandra Maß to Amsterdam to discuss these questions with us here today in her lecture, Heads Above the Water, Writing History in the Anthropocene. Sandra Maß is a professor of transnational history of the 19th century at the Ruhr University Bochum, and her research revolves around the intriguing subjects of cultural history of the economy, the history of childhood, and European colonial history. She studied history and sociology in Bochum, obtained her PhD at the European Institute in Florence, and subsequently worked in Bielefeld, where she wrote her second book, Kinderstube des Kapitalismus, monetäre Erziehung im 18. und 19. Jahrhundert. She went on to be the deputy director of the Georg Eckert Institute für internationale Schulbuchforschung in Braunschweig before moving to Bochum. And her recent projects deal with both the global history of the family in the 19th century and with the concept of the Anthropocene, about which she will shortly publish the book Zukünftige Vergangenheit, Geschichte schreiben im Anthropozän. Sandra, I'm very excited about the fact that you're actually willing to give us a preview of your work today. And your lecture will be followed by comments by my colleague Krijn Thijs from the Duitsland Institute Amsterdam. I will also quickly introduce him so that you don't have to see me at the stage before we move to the questions anymore. Krijn Thijs is an expert in the modern history of Germany and the Netherlands, and particularly also the history of historiography and memory. And that makes him the ideal candidate to comment on Sandra Maß's lecture, I think. He's also a regular participant in the meetings of the research group Environment and Society, and so has, I think, all the necessary qualifications to guide us along in the discussion. And after Krijn's comments and Sandra's response to the comments, we will open up the floor to your questions and for discussion. So I'm very much looking forward to your lecture, Sandra, and the floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter, for the kind introduction. Thank you to the audience for coming here. I think this needs to be that way, yeah? And thanks for the invitation by the DIA, by the University of Amsterdam, and also to the people, the team of the SPOI 25 for their hospitality. For those of you who came here with high expectations, I have bad news. There are two reasons why you could go home immediately. First, the Vatican of the geologist, a subcommission in the International Commission of Stratigraphy, recently voted against the Anthropocene as a new geological epoch. So there is no topic. Second, one could argue that the climate crisis will become so existential for humanity that the question of writing history will pale into insignificance in the face of the coming devastations. So there is no question. Now, before you rush out of the room, I would like to announce that I'm trying to present counter-arguments with my talk. I will argue that historians should not care about the geologists' decision because they work with completely different timescales. The Anthropocene has better insights to offer than just another simple time unit. To the second point, will historians and writing history become a luxury in the emerging climate crisis? I don't think so. On the contrary, I will argue that we urgently need a new way of research, a new way of collaboration and of narration. If you are a historian, you may be interested in the disciplinary dimension of this part of my talk. If you are here out of general interest or friendship, you may have a slightly different take on the question. What kind of stories will be told in the future about the planetary crisis, its genealogy, and its interconnectedness? Do we need historians at all to understand climate change and its effects better, to survive them, and to slow down the processes? Or should we better all focus on building dams and efficient pumps? I want to argue that we need new stories to grasp the social, political, and economic realities under rising sea level and extreme weather events. We should prepare to offer something when the chips are down, and we need to keep our heads above water. And yes, dams and pumps are also important, not to damage Dutch confidence directly in the beginning. So in the following 42 minutes, I think, I want to talk about the encounter between the Anthropocene and history as a discipline and about future pasts. And we'll do so in 3 steps. Well, let's see. Yeah. First, starting with the Anthropocene debate, I will describe the uncertainty of some historians about their professional activities. Second, I will talk about the challenges of the encounter between the Anthropocene and history, especially with regard to the time of nature. And third, I will sketch some methodological options that I find promising as a reaction to the pressing condition of climate crisis. And what I'm telling you today stems from the book project I just finished, and it will be published by the end of September. And so much for the advertisement today. Now you're free to carry on. I would like to begin by briefly explaining what the Anthropocene is about before discussing the response of historians. What began as a discussion in the geological and Earth system science about the end of the Holocene has generated intense intellectual excitement across disciplines in recent years. The historian of science, Jürgen Renn, has compared it to the impact of Einstein's theory of relativity on our concepts of time and space. For those who prefer a more modest approach, I think the Anthropocene debate is roughly comparable to the impact of the modernity debate, which had its controversial echoes across the humanities and social sciences in the last millennium. But unlike this Eurocentric debate, which was once sharply criticized by Chakrabarty, the Anthropocene is a global debate. Research in Asia, Africa, Europe, Arctic, and Antarctica reveal regional focuses and global inequalities, but also common concerns. It's planetary. the Anthropocene debate had a very specific birth date, according to the current literature, when the Dutch chemist, physicist, and Nobel Prize winner Paul Crutzen exclaimed the following words in Mexico in 2000. "Stop using the word Holocene. We are not in the Holocene anymore. We are in the Anthropocene." Since then, Crutzen's exclamation has been stylized as a eureka moment for science and is repeated in every publication on the topic. But what was his reason for the proclamation of a new geological epoch? The starting point was his observation, and not only his, that human influence could be clearly measured in the various spaces of planetary existence: the atmosphere, the lithosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere, and the anthroposphere. Alongside plate tectonics, erosions, volcanic eruptions, and meteorite impacts as known causes of Earth system changes, a new actor has emerged: humankind. And since all of these spheres in the Earth system are connected to one another, we are so-called material flows. The human influence on the biosphere, for example, can also be measured in the other spheres. The measurable impact of human activity do indeed have clear consequences. The intensive use of fossil fuels and the associated carbon dioxide emissions are melting the polar ice caps. Energy-intensive livestock farming is destroying open land areas. Conventional mass agriculture leads to the reduction of biodiversity, and the use of radioactive isotopes deposits them in the Earth's crust. Most importantly, the rise in average temperature will change the relationship between the sea and the terrestrial spaces on the planet, to the disadvantages of humankind and some plants and some animals. Eternal burdens and eternal costs have never been higher than ever before in human history. Now you may wonder what is exactly new about the assumption that humans affect nature. Think of Karl Marx. He had a great deal to write about this relation between the humans and the nature and work. However, at the heart of the Anthropocene debate lies the assumption that there is no separate space, such as nature, that is being influenced, but rather a connection and entanglement between the spheres mentioned above. Sorry for the German version. The possibility of having set in motion an unstoppable destructive development of the planet is a defining and distinctive element of the Anthropocene concept. The concept itself had an astonishing career in recent years, notably in the arts, in museums, and in the humanities. Crutzen would be surprised, or was surprised, by the effect of the concept. The decision of the geologists is irrelevant for their use of the term, because in the meantime it is characterized by a diversity of meaning, and it would be impossible to recapture the discourse. And you may know that there are more than 120 alternative notions for the Anthropocene in the meantime. So people are really fiercely debating what comes first and how the epoch should be named. Historians have been rather late in the debate. This is probably also related to the clear future orientation of the Anthropocene. But lately, this reluctance seems to vanish. What does it mean to be a historian on a planet on fire? Canadian historians asked 3 years ago. Already back in 2013, Christophe Bonnet and Jean-Baptiste Frézeau tried to develop new narratives about the history of industrial capitalism based on fossil fuels with the words, rethinking the past to open up the future. Historians, they wrote, have a special responsibility to develop new narratives. They should keep alive the memory of past interpretations, struggles, and defeats, as these past experiences are important for the challenges ahead. Also, Deepak Chakrabarty calls for new historiography, one that is able to capture all the history of life on the planet. He even hopes that the combination of different temporal levels within historical writing will mitigate climate-related problems. And finally, the historian Julia Adonai searches for a new way to think about humans relate to the planet. If you look for more concrete proposals of these authors, you will find that they are quite heterogeneous. But there is some common ground in, first, the rejection of dichotomous concepts of nature and culture, on the need to integrate natural science research into historical perspectives, and on widening the temporal structures in historical narratives. And today I would like to address 2 of the 3 points here, the question of time of nature and the approach of more than human history, thereby touching on point 3 and 1 here. My second point, from stage to actor, time of nature in the writing of history. The professional development of history as a discipline has a long history of excluding everything from its radar that is not human and has not left written sources. This division of labor has been the basis of disciplinary divisions between history and ethnology, but also between history and natural history, geography, geology, among others. In famous phrases, the German historian Johann Gustav Droysen underlined the Geist of human history in contrast to the cyclic times of nature, reproduction, and sexuality, which he saw dominated by space and not by time. He used the interesting example of marriage to explain the difference in 1882. Sexual lust and the drive to copulate are removed from temporality and therefore do not belong to history. Moral power, and thus withdrawn from cyclical nature, only arises through a married life that goes beyond instinct, den Trieb, through the shared memories, worries, hopes, losses that form the history of marriage. Well, after 30 years and more of history of sexuality, we know he got it slightly wrong. And for the sake of the second Mrs. Droysen, we hope he had at least some variations to offer. She was already dead when he wrote these sentences. But to get a full picture, there have always been other attempts to write history beyond the human and beyond the written sources. Most of them were French, by the way. Fernand Braudel was one of those historians who did not want to leave the history of nature, landscapes, and tides to geographers or natural scientists alone. He dedicated the first volume of his History of the Mediterranean to, I quote, man in his relationship to the environment, a history in which all change is slow, a history of constant repetition, ever-recurring cycles. I could not neglect this almost timeless history, the story of man's contact with the inanimate. In Brodell's view, natural conditions, landscapes, plants, and animal life, although changing in slow cycles, were part of history. He did not judge nature merely as a stage for human history. So some historians, and he's just one example, have thus been aware that there is more to history than human beings. However, they have generally assigned different timescales to nature. So although Brodell is often cited as a positive example of integrating nature into history, he and others regarded change in nature as slow and repetitive. The Anthropocene has changed this big divide between the time of nature and the time of human history significantly. Let's have a look at the geological, geographical, and ecological factors that are used in the Anthropocene debate as evidence for the alleged acceleration of planetary change. Here, the view of the slow history of nature looks different. The temporality of nature seems to have changed. It has accelerated. The Great Acceleration Thesis, published by climate scientist Will Steffen and others in 2004 for the first time, is based on a comprehensive collection of data on the impact of humanity on the planet. It's about carbon dioxide, ocean acidification, tropical forest loss, water use, dam building, etc. The data collected show a sharp increase in all the factors recorded in the second half of the 20th century. And for these reasons, the acceleration of anthropogenic influence after 45 is considered by some to be the beginning of the Anthropocene. Whether or not we agree on an exact birth rate, date, the evidence makes one thing quite clear. Nature, or rather the planetary spheres, can neither be understood as a stage for human history, nor as an almost immobile matter. One could even argue that the technical sovereignty of humanity over nature that has been acquired, or at least declared, is reversed, as human control over the natural environment will dissolve, not least with the unforeseeable tipping points. So in sum, the last argument for the exclusion of nature from the radar of historians has dissolved. Does this mean that the history of Earth system can easily be integrated into the historian's narrative? I am not convinced. Let me explain with one example why it may become difficult to become truly multidisciplinary. Again, Chakrabarty, among others, took up the question of the relationship between geological and human time in the wake of the burgeoning Anthropocene debate in 2009. He was one of the first historians to ask how the geological time horizon relates to the human time horizon, and to propose extending the time horizons of history in a geological direction. His suggestion was often applauded, but raises, I think, a number of practical and theoretical problems, and I would like to point to them shortly. Let me start by explaining what is geological time, and I'm sorry if I bore you to hell because you know it already, but I never know what one can assume in the audience. Therefore, I give a short introduction. How is geological time scale measured? In geology, time of the universe is hierarchically divided into aeons, eras, periods, epochs, and ages. The time spans become finer and finer, ranging from several 100 million years in the case of an aeon to thousands of years in the case of an epoch. However, the length of the time units can vary greatly. The units of time follow each other linearly. The International Chronostratigraphic Table illustrates the geological time dimension, which covers over 4.6 billion years. And human life is only a tiny fraction on these time scales. You find it in the left corner above. The justification for the replacement of a time unit, or for the addition of a time unit, and the beginning of a new one, they are standardized. The GTS is based on chrono and geostratigraphy with temporal transitions derived from the identification of fossil deposits, rock science, and magnetic field analysis. The determination of the so-called golden spike is of crucial importance for the change of a geological time unit. The sediment profile usually shows a so-called Fußpunkt, a foot point, a fossil or climatic boundary that determines the chronostratigraphic unit if this point can be detected globally. For a variety of reasons, there are tensions with the concept of historical time and the use of historical divisions. Temporal divisions, Since geology makes its linear classification of time based on firmly defined factors, it differs fundamentally from historians who stress heterogeneity and global difference. Compared to the geological time dimensions of several billion years, the time of historians seems rather small. It covers only the 5,500 years for which written evidence has been handed down, and in exceptional cases extends to prehistoric and early historical forms of life. Historians do not use golden spikes to categorize epochs, luckily, nor do they require global synchronicity. The epoch as the time between two fixed historical events is generally viewed critical by historians. And attempts to categorize epochs according to content, such as the century of the nation state, have become obsolete as a definitional description because they can be inherently Eurocentric and they lack global differentiation. Think of the century of nation states. In Europe, it might be the 19th century. In Africa, it might rather be the 20th century. So in recent years, historians and philosophers of history have discovered multi-temporal and multi-directional time regimes that argue against the coherence of an epoch or other time unit. Time concepts for historians, they vary regionally, they depend on the subject matter, and they do not follow a single direction. Just adding a new epoch, like an Anthropocene, is a step backwards into the early times of simple time units. The integration, if one follows the plea, the integration of geological time horizons will therefore succeed best with the object of study, such as coal, plutonium, volcanoes, extends beyond the human time horizon in its own accord. It is not yet clear whether the history of girls' education in grammar schools can be usefully extended by the inclusion of geological time horizons. And I asked my students this question, so whether this can be applied to girls' education in the 19th century. And they came up with a very funny answer. And, I spared the answer until we discuss it, because it's really a good answer. To conclude this part on the role of nature and time in the writing of history, in my opinion, it would make sense to understand this question as a continuation of a 200-year-old debate and not a revolution in thought. Clearly, in this debate, the institutional dominance of human-centered diplomatic and political history was initially secured as the Königsweg, royal road of historical scholarship. Political history even became synonymous with general history. In recent years, of course, this field has certainly undergone some considerable changes, but the responsibility for nature, for the history of nature, has been left to other humanities or to subdisciplines like environmental history. And this is what has to change, I think. Political history needs to be naturalized, environmental history to be normalized. The topics we analyze now and in the future do not allow for such a divide, especially not under the condition of climate crisis. And with that, I would like to address my third and last point: follow the relations, holobionts, tentacular, and a pig's heart. There are several approaches that operate at a critical distance from the Anthropocene and the question of geological time. Approaches such as more than human history, science and technology studies, or actor network theory share the assumption that everything on planet Earth is defined by interconnectedness. And of course, the anthropologists wonder what is all new about this discovery. On the other hand, they fundamentally avoid any focus on humanity as the new actor in history, as geologists and Earth system scientists have argued. In all these approaches, the centrality of the human actor is questioned and replaced by an analysis of the mutual dependencies between humans, animals, technology, plants, and other organisms. In a deconstructivist turn, humans become the result of their entanglement. So it would not be sufficient to reduce this perspective outlined here as to a plea for the integration of animals into the narratives of classical historiography. Human nature is an interspecies relationship, wrote the anthropologist Anna Tsing. In this way of thinking, the concept of species is quite expanded to refer not only to the small group of mammals we might think of, but also to the diversity of species we don't think of or don't like to think of, like insects, mosses, worms, and so on. The basic assumption is that there is no way of living on this planet that could be described as autonomous, and the corona pandemic situation is the last example. Genetic, robotic, prosthetics, and even psychology also assume that the human system can only be understood in terms of its composition and interaction with its material environment. Biologists use the figure of the holobiont to describe this interconnectedness and symbiosis of organisms. Fungi work as the paradigmatic species for this idea. Tsing even uses the rhizomatic way of life as an example for the demands of life under conditions of climate crisis. Other scientists apply the concept of the holobionts to animals and humans. For example, the biologist Scott Gilbert even postulates that humans may be nothing more than holobionts. Yeah. Symbiosis is the way of life, he says. On Earth, we are all born holobionts. In this approach, nature and culture are considered intertwined, even inseparable at times. And a holobiont rarely exists alone. So imagine a web of holobionts, a collection of interconnections that historians could describe and analyze. If you feel dizzy, that's true. It's a rather complicated endeavor, and one that is not limited by time and space from the outset. And when you have once tried to design a research paper, you had to design time and space at the beginning, and every student of history has to do it, yeah? You don't follow a line somewhere without defining time and space before. So this makes it a really dangerous enterprise. And unfortunately, the duration of the funding may also limit the project considerably. My proposal for the writing of history in the Anthropocene is nevertheless to trace the tentaculars, as Donna Haraway called life along lines and symbioses. This can result in many stories standing next to each other in a multitude of different stories of different scale. And this is rather bad news for a historian, socialized old school like me. How might this be done? Rather than bore you with a reconstruction of the theoretical background, let me give you one practical example. It concerns the heart of a pig that I happen to be looking into for a workshop at the Natural Museum in Berlin. Maybe you remember the failed transplant of a pig's heart in January 2022. The patient, David Bennett, who initially survived but then died, illustrates not only the close, albeit asymmetrical relationship between humans and animals, but also the relational position that objects can take in this relationship. Here, the object would be the pig's heart. Pigs are considered ideal organ donors for humans because their metabolism is like that of humans. For this reason, pig tissue has long been used for human heart valves. Maybe some of you have that inside yourself already. However, there is more to xenotransplantation than the traditional history of using animal as a resource for humans. Firstly, we can argue with Haraway and many others that the character of a human being changes when it is also made up of animal organs, artificial intelligence, or classic artificial limbs. Secondly, the organ itself had also changed during these transplantation processes. The transplanted organ was no longer a genuine animal heart. The donor animal had been genetically modified to avoid rejection by the human immune system. The growth of the heart was stopped by genetic engineering, and 6 human genes were inserted to calm the immune system. The result was a humanized porcine heart. One could ask, is this pig heart still an organ alien to the human species? How many genetic changes are needed to humanize the pig heart and thus the pig? And finally, when do humans become animals? In the case described, the line between animal and technology is also not clear-cut, and this is another thread in the story. The donor pig was cloned at a pig farm in Virginia by Revivicur, the world's largest cloning company, which is part of United Therapeutics. The process was complex and cost millions of dollars. The so-called GAL-safe pig was approved by the US Food and Drug Administration in 2020 for human consumption and, of course, as a potential source for biomedical purposes. However, it will be difficult to bring the GAL-safe pig into mass production. Just one donor pig requires hundreds of eggs, which are genetically modified and implanted into a surrogate pig. Only 1 in 200 to 400 embryos will result in a usable donor pig. There is an obvious limit to the production. But there is another important thread in the story. Xenotransplantation has become the poster child of modern medical excellence in global capitalist competition. It is the global biotech companies with their CEOs and doctors who are cloning, transplanting, and connecting the pig heart to the human body. In recent decades, the commercialization of the body and its part has increased dramatically, becoming a major factor in global supply chains and national economies. The pig's heart is just one symbol of this growing global market. A market in which transgressions between animals and humans, between the sexes, between life and death, between the present and the future are normalized. The company that organized the xenotransplantation was United Therapeutics, an expanding company in the US. In January last year, United Therapeutics had a market capitalization of $11.8 billion. Martine Rothblatt is the founder and the president of United Therapeutics. She is the mastermind behind the xenotransplantation. Additionally, she also follows the idea that we will soon be able to fully feed the human brain into artificial intelligence to achieve digital immortality, defining herself thereby as a transhumanist. A law graduate, she began her career in satellite communication and space exploration. She founded United Therapeutics in 1996 and completed her doctorate in medical ethics on xenotransplantation in 2001. In the meantime, she underwent gender reassignment surgery and became an activist for transgender and transsexual rights. She published From Transgender to Transhuman, a manifesto on the freedom of form in 2011. So what you can see with this biography of Rothblatt and with her work, crossing boundaries and pushing what is medically feasible are essential. And I have a slide, I think, here. Yeah, here you see. It basically sums up the different stories I just told you at length. And you can see they can be related, but not necessarily. And I think it illustrates quite well what happens if you don't limit your research questions from the beginning. As you can see, such a journey does not necessarily end in the deep sea or in outer space. Depending on your point of departure and travel route along the relations that you discover, that might well happen. But the roadmap for such research designs would be to follow the construction and the relationality of your starting point. And, well, just try to define one of your research objects as a starting point and let it lead you through, all the relations you discover and come up with all these different stories and, ask your professor before you hand in this master thesis if he or she accepts this kind of manuscript. But just try out what different story comes up. I think that situations at the interface between scientific or natural and social phenomenon seem particularly suitable. And to succeed in this endeavor, it is necessary to cross disciplinary boundaries between economic, social, environmental, and political history and other disciplines in order to place chains of events with different scales, polyfocal perspectives, and different units in a historical context. Such an approach is likely to have more potential than simply answering the question of how humans became a geological force. As relevant as the history of the Anthropocene is, which can be very well treated in terms of traditional history of ideas. I'm interested in more than just a new topic. I prefer to discuss history in the Anthropocene. However, it is not possible to discover contamination and relations simply by widening the realms or the horizon of the investigations. Bigger is not better. Historical studies will have to oscillate between the geopolitics of the Anthropocene and the changes in Atlantic circulation, ocean circulation, between the devastating water supply in the mountains of Tajikistan and the imperial politics of post-Soviet Russia, between the history of childhood, digital childhood, and the rise of microplastics in the oceans, between the production of a gel-safe pig and the development of artificial intelligence. We need to dissect the Anthropocene into differently scaled, regional, and heterogeneous histories in order to escape a new hegemonic narrative. History, I think, is indispensable for explaining the evolved fabric of the planet. If we assume that climate change is a realistic crisis scenario for the planet, then historians will have to explain what geosciences and climate sciences diagnose and predict. They have the task of translating climatological, ecological, and also socio-political findings into analysis that not only reconstruct the main man-made history of the Anthropocene, but also clarify the historicity of the planet's interrelated structures. And this requires the visual sharpness of a housefly, a multifaceted eye that can see the diversity of relationships in a wide field of vision, even at the edges. How these changes can be incorporated into the training of teachers, how they can integrate the topic of the Anthropocene into the classroom is still largely unknown. To do this, historians will probably have to get dirty, crossing disciplinary, ontological, temporal, and spatial boundaries, disrupting institutional orders if possible, and breaking up belief systems. By 2050, at least, there will be many questions in school and in the universities and in the public, I hope, about how the planet could have transformed so dramatically. Historians can better prepare themselves to answer these questions with complexity and diversity. Thank you for your attention.
Hello, everybody. Many thanks, Sandra, for this highly interesting and stimulating paper. This truly is an important book, not only for our own discipline, not only raising urgent and sometimes undermining questions, but also offering new ideas, mostly uncertain, searching, avenues of thought to explore. I hear some kind of nice echo here. That was me. Okay. And you had some very interesting examples, of course, like the pig's heart to be transplanted, and some interesting categories as well to discuss the Anthropocene itself. There are many alternatives, you said. So in a couple of days, I think next week, there is an event here at Spui 25 under the name of the Symbiocene, discussing a lot of the same kind of stuff, probably not from an historical point of view. And at the same time, much of your discussion remains full of paradoxes in my ears. So in my commentary, let me develop some reflections and questions and doubts raised by your talk. it might also be some theoretical or rather colloquial ones, but also more general. And as you will notice soon, these are often remarks from the stance of a skeptical historian, not a climate change denier, but rather an old school historian, trying to keep up with the pace of time, also acceleration. And we might actually be closer together in the end than it seems from the onset. And I fear most of the points I will raise will not be new to you, I'm sure, actually, but they might give an entry in the discussion. So let me, and I think I have 5 points or questions to make. Let's see if they develop in that way. So to start with, I would like to invite you to say a few words more on the potential of your own concepts. You were rather short on them, of the relational and of the contamination in the history you propose, especially, of course, between the human and the non-human world around the planet. So where exactly is the breakthrough? Or is this also partly, as we say, old wine in new bottles with the naming of relational or contaminational history? How does this or should this improve on what we old-fashioned historians already have or have done earlier under names like the classical global history, which was all about interconnectedness, interwovenness of history, and the circulation of knowledge and things, and also materiality, projects, commodities, cotton, shoes, bananas, humans, and IDs, also animals. Where is the breakthrough point? And the same goes up for the French invention of the histoire croisée we had about 20 years ago, or longer ago probably, Peter, where we studied objects by the grace of their encounter and their transfer. So the idea that the positionality of the object defines what it is. Also on the subject of the historian, the positionality of ourselves, of researching. These concepts of selfing and othering, the idea that all the concepts are essentially dependent on each other, is, I think, a kind of echoing in your concept of relationality, and I would invite you to expand a bit on that. So is this also fundamentally new, or rather just an extension in something we already had, resulting in the integration into existing narratives, what you, of course, don't want to do? Yeah, I understand that. And to go a step further, second, how do we have to understand your project in relation to our discipline, the discipline of history? Are you revolutioning history, like Einstein or the modernity discussions you mentioned? Or are you rather trying to defend history? So your last words, like the plea for complexity and diversity you ended with, that is rather unsurprising for our own profession. We don't need a revolution for that, rather perhaps a restoration. So when you speak about the relationality of nature and culture spheres, about multiple time frames and adapting time horizons, isn't this also a new way to bring in our old techniques, like bringing in specific contexts, to drive away from the general, which has always been done in the other sciences, towards the specific and the smaller cases we like as historians? So in my ears, I like that a lot. I like to listen to that very much. And you are searching for ways to bring in, or you want to show is actually what historians can eigentlich do in this discussion. And that sounds to me like something else than exploding our discipline. Yeah. So, also your remark that historians are rather late in the Anthropocene debate is one of my favorites. We heard that more often, that historians are coming late, which in my ears is something that historians usually do. They come after. In the end, come the historians. So I'm not so much worried about this as a historian. Then I would like to proceed and pick up some of the issues you discussed yourself. So the third one would be a remark on the scale jumping in time and space, which of course is a very prominent point of debate in the Anthropocene history. And this is this very large picture you had, and you also had some criticisms on that, of course, because where do we insert our own beloved individuals and subjective experience, so the stuff of our histories, our usual stuffs? Does this history of humanity, or even a planetary history, doesn't that run the risk of falling back into the empty macro spaces we had in the 1960s and 70s? So the famous German word of the leere Strukturlandschaften, with an emphasis on leer. So this conceptually focusing on human nature merging in a planetary theater makes humanity to the actor of history, contaminated or not. And in my ears, there's a huge difference between the history of humans, or more than humans, and humanity as a single thing or a whole in a much larger cosmos. And how do we offer, or how to offer orientations or meaning for readers today in so large a theater, Sinn in a German way? So isn't this too large to identify, also to find audiences? And this is not, as you rightly stress, routine for historians who work with particular objects of research, particular spaces and scopes of scrutiny. You had this nice example of the girls' education in some small village somewhere. I, as a German history teacher or student, I'm slightly worried about the future of Duitsland studies in the Anthropocene, which is somehow sounds a bit contradictory. But more serious. So can we integrate usual stuff of histories like classic and urging as well, a war in Ukraine, or not to talk about the Middle East, in these pictures? Or does history from this angle has to say something about these classical historical stuff we are working on? So we usually study subunits of humankind. And your networks, of course, and the picture of the pig heart is perhaps an avenue to explore on that. We like also to tell stories to differentiated audiences, not to speak of more than humans. And I am not sure how to imagine history in this form of very large humankind history. So, pushing this a bit further, a fourth remark on the decentralization of the human subject as such. This nature-culture discussion is very convincing to me, but it also has its paradoxes, since we find our audiences usually among humans. So to me, it's clear to undermine humanity's imagination as an autonomous category or entity or being, and to expand on the concept of species, as you talked about. That's clearly for me and convincing and relevant to understand. But what about our histories and our knowledge of the past on the level of historiography? So can we share or contaminate the production of historical storytelling with actants or more than humans? So if storytelling is a communicative activity, who is the audience? Who is communicating? Other scientists or climate skeptics or climate deniers, and how to reach out to them with these kind of histories? And that would be fifth, my last question or point. Does a program like this necessarily have an activist stance as an academic or a civilist or a human? Is there a political implication? Our Dutch colleague, Amsterdam colleague Jesse van Amersfoort argues for a kind of natural connection, natural in the natural sense, argues for a natural connection between climate history and postcolonial history, to side our analysis with the global marginalized people who are suffering most and who are without resources to react. The German socialist Harald Welzer wrote about this long ago under the label of the future Klimakriege. I would wonder how you see that. So also the graphs you showed are straightforward, alarming. Those dooming lines all go up. And then this thinking about tipping points who are threatening us to come in the future. And moreover, might this contamination or relational narrative as a method to irritate existing old narratives, might it also be a tool to build new ones, also grander ones? Do we have to stick to counter narratives? So why do you stress the need to escape master narratives, which might also be so urgent in our age? Do we still have an issue with power? Would some power for this knowledge not be rather useful? So these questions were all related, I think, and they switch between the non-believer and the disciple. Yeah, so we all search for the match between the historical and the climate change, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Es leuchtet nicht. It's not on, I think, or I can press the button.
Yeah.
Yeah. It should be green probably.
Yeah, it takes like half a minute to load.
Okay.
Very good, then I have 30 seconds.
I will. So we will proceed as following. Sandra has a half a minute to to consider these comments, and as soon as the microphone is working, I would invite her to respond to Klein's comments first, and then we'll open up the floor for your questions. And please wait until the microphone is brought to you if you want to pose a question, so that the people at home can also hear your question and are involved in our discussion. So, Sandra?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I don't have a thing here, so it's for women, huh? So, yeah, thank you very much, Klein, for these pressing questions, friendly but serious questions. And I will not answer all of them, so calm down, and we do that afterwards, continue the discussion. But I will pick three, I think, of them. And let me start with, do I want to explode the discipline in which I was socialized and in which I'm teaching? Yes and no.
This takes another 30 seconds or what?
Take that one.
So strategic, then I can have time to think about the answer. Huh? I switched to the microphone. And yes and no. I started the project like a missionary. I was really into the Anthropocene literature and wanted to convince everybody. Thank you. But reading and thinking, hopefully, I thought that really there are serious problems, as I pointed out shortly, between the geological time unit and the work of the historians and so on, and also the history of the relation of historians to the topic of nature is not so clear-cut. So I cannot claim that no historians has ever looked into the history of nature. So there is no revolution. It's rather picking up old traditions that have been minorized. Clearly, the hegemonic path in history is political and diplomatic history, wars, and has changed with working class history, gender history, animal history, and so on, the material history, and so on. But still, nature has not been fully integrated. And therefore, I think I'm a reformist in this question. But if you, well, I don't know if this is very nice. On the other hand, we have open positions for professorship in economic history. And then we have a professorship for political history. And they all have their own clubs, associations. They have their own doctoral students. And they have their own journals and paths, how you do your career in this field. But why do you have to separate political and economic history? Look at the history of capitalism and neoliberalism. It doesn't make any sense at all. Although I wouldn't deny that there are specific ways of learning, teaching, instruments, methods, languages at times that strengthen the division. But I think there is some useless separation in our university academic system. Therefore, I'm a revolutionary at this point. Because, as I tried to show you, the topic itself does not offer or does not ask for such a separation. It does not ask for an economic perspective alone. Of course, clearly you can go on the history of biotech capitalism, but why excluding all the question of transgender, or why excluding the question of the border between humans and animals? Yeah. So this is why I'm revolutionary, although I don't like to claim myself a revolutionary. Well, I'm clearly not claiming that I'm doing something completely new, because there have been developments in global microhistory, for example, and anthropology, but also in a minor field like relational history, where people have, and colleagues have already thought through the question on what is a relation in comparison to the connection of global history. You mentioned that we have talked about all these connections. And I think there is a fundamental difference, as the connections of global history have been the networks, the infrastructure of humans, have been seen as the network of humans. And the relationality is, well, philosophically, you would divide between inner relations, like the bacteria within your body show that you are a holobiont, but you also have connections to, well, outer relations, obviously, to others. Well, you are a father because you have children or something like that. So there is a more complex concept of relationality. I will leave the contamination out because it's keeping too much time. I'm sorry. We go on with the beer. Yes, can we integrate the classic stuff in the Anthropocene? And I pick up the grammar school of girls' education I told you about. Because when I ask my students, well, what do you do? The Anthropocene and girls' education, where's the connection? Yeah, they really thought hard. And one said, and I really loved it, well, you know, when the girls entered secondary schooling and were allowed to go to university, you had to build new buildings, you had to construct new buildings. The same applies to the Bildungsoffensive of the 60s and 70s in Western European countries and others, where these ugly universities like Bochum, the one where I have to teach, were constructed full of concrete, asbestos, PCB, and other stuff that is really a threat to the environment and to the bodies. So with including more and more people, you had to construct more buildings, and you polluted the environment. That was the answer of my student. I really liked it because it was like really long way. The thinking was not very obvious, but it was creative, and therefore I think, yeah, why not try hard. Maybe not everything fits the horizon, but maybe. Okay, last point, maybe let me, activism. I don't think a historian needs to be an activist, nor is it forbidden to be an activist. And I think that these are different roles people fulfill, and quite successfully in most cases, unsuccessfully in some cases. But in general, I think you play different roles in your life. I mean, everybody knows, of course, that you can be an academic, serious academic, and be a violent table tennis player or a militant demonstrator for something. So that, there's place for all of us, I think. So I leave it here and would like to hear the audience, maybe.
We have to use this microphone probably, yeah?
Is there any? Yeah, Mara?
Thank you for your talk and the interesting ideas you presented here. I want to continue on the activism question, and you said there are different roles, and I would probably push back a little bit. Why shouldn't they exactly be related? Shouldn't historical research and activism be much more combined in the Anthropocene, since if it's anthropogenic climate change, then humans are part of the problem, and maybe historians should show how this goes on, where the problems come from, how they persist into the present, and thus guide activism and be committed to activism themselves to combat these problems. Why talk of different roles if they maybe should exactly be integrated?
And maybe as the microphone travels back, I can add a question that popped up when you spoke about this, that is more focused maybe even on history writing. There's this famous attack of Amitav Ghosh on literature, saying that most particularly Western literature, of course, is kind of implicated in producing the Anthropocene, in centering humans in a way, and particularly individual stories. In that case, blinding readers to kind of the situation of nature. Is there a similar way in which you would say history writing is implicated in a very specific way in producing the Anthropocene, or is this just something for us to react to, but that we have no special obligation or special fault of our own to reckon with? But please.
Yeah, I think it's a different question, I think, but I will try to combine them. Well, think about a historian of fascism, which could be like the parallel story. Of course, he or she can be an anti-fascist activist. But while researching the history of Italian, German, Dutch fascism, you sometimes have to explain things. So you have to, be differentiated. You have to be nuanced. You stick to your sources, and you have to, really be detailed. I think on the street there is no place for this. Of course, it's good to be kind of an advisor or something, but it's not necessary that you reduce your detailed view to the much needed, more parole-like activist form of sentence. This is, I feel unwell if I would mix both positions. I couldn't do so because I'm try to be nuanced and detailed, and on the street it doesn't work well, neither as an anti-fascist nor as an environmental activist. So you need to press the issue, to change things politically, you need to be tough and strong and, also dogmatic. Otherwise, it doesn't change. And as a historian, I don't want to be dogmatic. It's bad history, I would say, bad history writing. We probably have a fight about that in the coming days. I'm looking forward to it. So, I think historians, of course, they have a responsibility for their narratives. In that way, they are activists, because the way they write, and they write about their agents of history, they either present a white male European actor who is really pushing history and historical change, or they try and follow the imagination of this autonomous subject, or they try to discover how well interwoven these actors were, and how weak and struggling and insecure and interrelated and so on. So I would say this is the responsibility of historians, and this is what I would like to see as a new narrative, that what you were doubting a bit, that our beloved subject is not over, or but it is a different kind of subject. And of course, if you look at the pig story, it doesn't make sense without a human. I mean, it was implanted into a human being. It was implanted by a human. The company is owned by a human. So we really have to look at subjects. Also in terms of responsibility, we need to discuss who is responsible for climate crisis, of course. Yeah, so we shouldn't forget them, but we should place them differently in our narrative.
Who else like to ask a question? Here.
I have a question. So it's related to the reconciling the tensions of scale and periodization and perspectives. And so I've been thinking about it quite a bit. And I was based on the thought of Hayden White, who treats the work of history. He stresses its literary characteristic. And so I was wondering, do you think that alternative modes of literary representation can be useful?
Thank you.
Well, I also like to hear the views, opinions of my two colleagues here. But I think, yes, of course. I give you two examples. One is the Feral Atlas of Anna Tsing, which you may know. It's a digital museum, if you want, and it's really chaotic, and it really takes time to discover things, but it's also hard work. But it's a fabulous way because it represents the interrelatedness of everything. And the other is the book by Frank Kötter Im Strudel, which is the Vortex. Yeah. And he is like, it's a brick of a book, 1,000 pages and more. But what he tries to do is the same as Anna Tsing. He tells short stories, and within these short stories, he has a reference system. And in the beginning, he explains how you can use the book. So you can follow the reference system. You read one story, and then you have this go on page 250, and you can follow the history of bees or something, yeah? So I think this is very nice. It's still conventional. It's written in a book, but it offers another reading habit, another way to grasp the book.
Just to pick up on that one, and it's a nice question because we all are struggling with the linearity of history, and this is also the linearity of our texts. So usually we produce text, except the examples you mentioned, but who read from, and Hayden White with his plot structures is also in a larger way of thinking about it. These are stories to be told from a beginning to an end, and White worked with different representational modes on this, and the level of literature as well. And I see many of the examples we like to discuss are trying to break away from this linearity of history as well as our own texts, and searching for natural metaphors like the web or like the vortex, and draaikolk, where is also this moment of acceleration very strong. And what I like in the work of Uketer as well is that he includes the historians, also ourselves, into the big maelstrom of the vortex. So there is no point outside, and we don't have any stance to observe what we are studying because we are part of it. And my impression is that these smaller histories, like Uketer also is telling, that they try even to refrain from a story with a beginning and an end. These are rather fragments, like small things, and you can tell them, but they are not bordered off in. You can start everywhere and can end everywhere, and then we come, I would say, to the limitations to what we historians can do in our way of producing knowledge. So these are small fragments, and that would be a new way of collecting knowledge or design knowledge, perhaps. And I'm not entirely convinced of this, but this metaphorical from nature, this work of metaphors that is something I see a lot on this field.
Okay, I think I can use this one, right? Yeah. I still have a working microphone here. Yes, I mean, I think this is a very important question, and I think one of the interesting things about these new narratives is that they try to break up this linearity. But there is, and I was reminded of this when we were looking at the Stefan graphs, for example, in thinking about the Anthropocene. This is a very linear story, and I'm thinking whether if we want to write history, well, particularly, of course, there's two discussions kind of in parallel here. One about writing history of the Anthropocene and one of writing history in the Anthropocene. But particularly for a history of the Anthropocene, I mean, I think the question that historians kind of following up on this almost avant-garde mode of narrating that we've discovered as a new entry point, whether we are actually saying that we need to change the narrative about the Anthropocene, that the Stefan graphs are actually in that sense falling short of telling the real history of the Anthropocene as well, or whether we do need a linear history of the Anthropocene and can have very many other stories next to that are kind of informed by our Anthropocene perspective. And I think this is quite a pressing question right now, whether we actually agree that our current moment is actually marked by a linear story of expansion and increasing pollution, or whether we also need to alter that. And I think that is kind of the question that we're running up against right now, and that I don't have the answer to right now, but I mean, at least it's out there, I think.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture. I'll preface my comment by saying I'm a total layperson in this subject. But while you were giving your lecture, I had to think of several journalists, such as Dan Saladino, who has written a book called Eating to Extinction, and Charles C. Mann, who's written about relationship, both of those authors, relationship between biology and history. So, for instance, how the discovery by Columbus of Latin America, how that affected flora and fauna throughout the world. So I was wondering, is there a contrast between academic historians and more popular historians, to put it that way, or that write for a more popular public? And is it maybe there's a lot happening, but maybe academic historians are a bit behind the curve, if I can put it that way? Because there is, I know that Dan Saladino is going to write a new book about exactly what you're talking about. And there's also a very well-known British person, I forgot her name, who's in evolutionary biology, unfortunately passed away, who was also talking about the holobiont and things like that. So I was just wondering if it's maybe a more multidisciplinary approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. I don't know about the books you refer to, but of course, environmental history has dealt with the question why the indigenous population of the Americas died so fast and in such huge numbers. has dealt with this considerably in depth and quite early. But this was within the field, I would now say, not to assault you, but the traditional field of environmental history. Yeah? So, and I think that these studies are now revived, so do you say revive? Revitalized, yes, also by journalists and who in the face of the climate crisis, popularize also scientific findings of historians. So here I would really defend historians being like the avant-garde, and it's finding a different public right now, these findings of environmental historians in face of the Anthropocene debate. On the other hand, there is a lot in the museum, in the art, that is going on, and historians are not very fast in picking it up, of course.
Klein would argue that that is actually our role, is to come after. So in that sense, but I think there is a very important question here that connects to your question, is that we see journalists and all kinds of other science writers popularizing these stories, and that at the same time we mostly consider writing kind of avant-garde histories that are non-linear, that complicate things. So should we be satisfied with kind of informing those popularizing accounts without mingling in them ourselves, or should we also be trying to write the kind of books or the kinds of stories that actually resonate with that broader public? And would that mean also refraining from being all too experimental in the kinds of ways we write history? Because of course one of the things that speaks for at least the traditional history writing is that it was able to reach a larger audience. At least some of the works were, and I get the sense from, for example, the Vortex, which is a great book, that is not the kind of book a general reading audience is taking up in the same way. Yeah. Yeah, we should.
Thank you really much for the super interesting lecture. And I have a question about, you are using the term relation quite a lot, and I kind of feel like it's less than satisfying for me. As a term, I think it's like a bit too general, and then I kind of it reminds me of something which made more concrete for me. For example, like Niklas Luhmann. He's actually Niklas Luhmann. He's actually using the term of, or this the language of systems of cybernetics, like to actually study like something like codification and love and passion, love as passion, something like this. So there is an argument that actually you emerge as a system, or you and another person emerge as a system out of an environment, and that is sort of kind of what strikes me as one very much autonomous relation that has to be distinguished, but emerges from it and separate from it, and which is paradoxical because you don't really know how to achieve both at the same time or at different times. And another approach perhaps like would be like the philosopher Gilbert Simondon, and then he was saying you are always pre-individual. You're always pre-individual because you are, and then when you're doing this individuation, you're actually, these are two magnitudes come of two different medium come into contact with each other, and that's how, for example, crystallization actually happens, and that makes it more optimistic. Then you can make the argument that we're all connected and we all come from elements and something like this. But with Luhmann, it sort of feels like we still have the need to be autonomous, and or are we animals, or are we robots? And are we able to be robot, or are we able to be automaton? Because automaton has feedback, doesn't have a feedback loop, but robots can achieve that. So, sorry, this is very confusing, but it's just what I have in mind when you mention the term relation. And I kind of feel like if we don't actually go into detail, it's risking being a bit elitist, or I don't know, then it just become like like a cure that is not a cure at all. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we'll take that as our final question because we wanted to have half an hour for us to have drinks and discuss any other questions over drinks over here before we have to leave the building at 7. So let's solve this.
Well, well, thank you very much. It's really like giving me food for thought now, and I'm slightly panicked because the manuscript needs to be at the publishing house in 3 days. So I haven't considered Niklas Luhmann and his Systemtheorie, but I have a couple of pages on the notion of relation, which I, for obvious reason, have not referred to here, and in which I refer mainly to the very detailed reconstruction by Marilyn Strathern, the anthropologist, who is really making a plea for very broad notion of relation, but in the sense that she defines all the different layers the notion can be applied to. For a historian, this worked well, I think, but I can understand that you could go with a more defined, more strongly defined notion of relation. I have to consider it. I don't know, and I cannot answer better at the moment. But thank you for that.
Thank you. I would, by way of wrapping up, would really like to thank Sandra Maß and Krijn both for a fascinating lecture and for your thought-provoking comments. So maybe you would join me in applauding them once more for that. And of course, thank you all for coming and engaging in this discussion. Please join us for drinks to delve into any other questions that we might be discussing, and I hope to see you soon again here.